Hello, my name is Randy Bodie. Today I'm going to discuss Fritz Perls' Gestalt Theory and Therapy. The agenda for this presentation will be as follows. A brief biography of Fritz Perls, what is Gestalt, a description and an example, the origin of Gestalt theory, the objective of Gestalt therapy, the techniques of Gestalt, and I will conclude with Perls' prayer. A brief biography of Fritz Perls was the founder of Gestalt therapy. He was born in Germany in 1893 and died in 1970. He is famous for bringing to the public Gestalt psychotherapy. He immigrated to South Africa to escape the Nazi persecution. He was Jewish, and ultimately immigrated to the United States, settling in New York. He developed Gestalt therapy in the 1950s and founded the Gestalt Institution of New York in 1952. He was influenced by the research of psychiatrists who were looking into and studying human perception. Perls used self-perception as the fundamental building block of his theory. What is Gestalt? It's a German word that means complete pattern or configuration. A Gestalt is a perceived whole. Gestalt theory uses this rule or this definition. Used in context with Fritz Perls describes it as such. A Gestalt is something which is greater than the sum of its parts. A practical example is in shape perception. Consider a square, which is a geometric shape, and the figure comprised of four straight lines, equal lines, bound by four right angles. However, we do not see this. What we see is a square. Though the square must be comprised of straight lines and angles, it is a complete shape that we see. In other words, the square is very different from the component parts, as noted from the website Gestalt Theory 2012. The origin of Gestalt therapy, as noted by Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, as a phenomenological existential therapy. Both therapist and patient can learn from this. According to this method, one should see the differences between perceptions, feelings, and actions and the interpretations. Explanations alongside with interpretations are regarded as not so trustworthy. Differences in perceptives and the center of the dialogue of the therapist and the patient, Yontef, 1983. The patient should be able to understand the actions they are performing and what they are and why they are performing them and how it is possible for them to alter themselves to discover how to accept and appreciate themselves. Riley and Jones, 2009. In other words, Gestalt therapy highlights the process about what is taking place, and not the content about what is said. The emphasis is on what is happening right now, rather than on what took place, might have taken place, could happen. This is a method of awareness practice by which is the distinction between the direct experience versus the indirect or secondary interpretation, and it is developed in the process of the therapy. The patient learns to become aware that what he or she is doing triggers and the ability to risk or shift change. This ultimately is to increase the patient's self-awareness and the understanding of a wider world. Perls calls the patients like being an onion, which had many layers that had to be carefully peeled back to find the true inner self, which was revealed. Because Gestalt therapy includes perceptions and meaning, making the process by which experience forms, and it can be considered cognitive approach. Also, Gestalt looks at the worldwide picture, which is complex, involving multiple influences in the situation. It can be considered a multi-systematic approach. Gestalt therapy techniques. Perls describes his therapy and techniques in the three approaches psychotherapy glory in 1975 in this way: I and thou in the here and now basis. In other words, to hold the obvious on the surface of a situation, we find ourselves to develop the emerging Gestalt. Any escape into the future or into the past is examined as a likely resistance against the ongoing encounter. The basic technique is this: not to explain things to the patient, but to provide the patient with the opportunity to understand and discover himself. Perls' method is to manipulate and frustrate the patient in such a way that he is frustrated and he confronts himself. In the process, he identifies with his lost potential. For instance, assimilating his projections and imaginations by acting out the ailing parts of himself. Perls considered any interpretation by the therapist to be a therapeutic mistake, as this would imply that the therapist understood the patient better than the patient himself. Also, this takes away from the patient's chance of discovering himself by himself and prevents himself from finding out his own values and style. Also, there is a disregard for the most of the content of what the patient says and more concentration on the nonverbal. In Perls' view, the nonverbal is less subject to self-deception. On the nonverbal level, the relevant gestalt is always emerged and can be dealt with in the here and now. As described by Laura Wagner Moore in an article in Psychology Theory Research Practice Training, 2004, Volume 41, she describes the technique of gestalt therapy and Perls' application of them as creative, artistic, and embodying an unusual, charismatic, authentic approach to the treatment. And to further describe this, Perls himself, in the interview of Gloria in 1975, describes his techniques as one of an artist, trying to bring out something out of the patient. The acting out approach has been researched by Leslie Greenberg, 1988, on the two-chair dialogue and the empty chair dialogue. This was used to explore the patient's relationship with himself or the people in the lives and the techniques involving the patient addressing the empty chair as if it was another person was in it. This may also be a movement between the two chairs to act out one or more sides of the discussion, typically involving the patient and the person of significance to them. A form of role-playing that focuses on finding the self and to help the patient self-adjust. During this role-playing, the therapist would ask questions like the following: what do you do? What do you feel? What do you expect? And what do you avoid? I would like to conclude with Perls' prayer. Stop it.